I'd like to thank Alex Lubin, Nancy Batakji, and the staff at CASAR for inviting me and arranging my visit. It's my first time here, and it's been amazing so far. I'd like to share an excerpt from my current project, which is on race and popular culture after 9/11. And it comes out of the work that I did for my first book, which was primarily about Black and Latino filmmakers and activists' contribution to the modern civil rights movement. For this project, I've taken that expertise and I've used it as a window onto Arab American racialization and how that's been linked to US imperial ambitions since September 11, 2001. One of my central claims is that you cannot fully understand contemporary Arab American racialization without also understanding how African Americans have been racially repositioned since 9/11. US popular culture, and particularly TV culture, is a great place to look because there, producers, writers, directors, actors, can present imaginary solutions to real political and ideological problems facing US audiences. In developing this claim today, I want to consider the following questions. First, how were Arab Americans racialized prior to 9/11? Secondly, how did that racialization shift after 9/11, or did it shift? And what were the main legal or institutional mechanisms driving that shift? And finally, as the racialization of Arab Americans have shifted over the last decade, can we see parallel or intersecting shifts in the racialization of African Americans? And why would that be the case? And what have the political and ideological consequences of that intersection been? The main way I want to look at questions of intersecting racialization is through the lens of a recent television show called Sleeper Cell and a 2008 Hollywood film, Traitor. Both utilize African-American actors playing devout Muslims working undercover to infiltrate terrorist cells and stop attacks against the US. And they follow the identical kind of formula. What I want to argue over the next little bit is if prior to 9/11, Arab immigrants and Arab Americans were racially located in relationship to whiteness, their racialization turned then on their ability to prove that they were white, often conflated with, but not always reducible to Islam. Since 9/11, one's identity as Muslim has been conflated with Arab, meaning we've seen the racing of religion, to borrow Mustafa Bayomi's phrase, such that to be Muslim is automatically to be Arab, and to be Arab is to automatically be a terrorist, and to be both is to automatically place one in proximity not only to non-whiteness, but I think also to blackness. So the peculiar black-white binary that has historically defined US racial formations has been repurposed to define Muslims, a process, and Arabs, a process you can see most clearly in US popular culture. So let me give you an example, a concrete example of what I'm talking about here. So the April 15th Boston Marathon bombing, in which 3 people died and hundreds were maimed and injured, was allegedly committed by the Tsarnaev brothers, 2 ethnic Chechens from Kyrgyzstan, a region of the Caucasus in Russia. In the 4 days before they were caught, there was a debate about whether they would turn out to be white. So there wasn't a discussion so much about whether they were going to be Muslim terrorists. It was actually waged as, are they white? And in many ways, people did think of this as being reducible to Muslim, but the primary terms of engagement were always about whiteness. And another kind of way of thinking about this would be to say that before we knew their identities, there was all this kind of chatter on social media in which people referred to the terrorists as, in quote, sand niggers. So it was very kind of crudely sort of stitched together in that moment. So if one plays by the US racial rule book, it's not even an open question. The Tsarnaevs are white, they're literally Caucasian. They're not Arab immigrants, period. But if one considers how Islam and terrorism, for which it is often synonymous in the US, has been positioned in relationship to not just non-whiteness, but blackness, then we can see why debates on their racial identity have been so intensely heated. That is, Arab immigrants and Arab Americans have now found themselves branded a suspect population, one that is often directly or indirectly compared to African Americans whose position in the US and history of racial oppression is contrasted to the, in quotes, necessary, unquote, curtailing of Arab American civil liberties. The fact that African Americans were unfairly denied full citizenship rights in the past, a historical wrong that was allegedly remedied during the civil rights movement, paradoxically stands as proof that the US government today is not and cannot be accused of unfairly persecuting Arab and or Muslim Americans and immigrants. And those I think of it as Arab/Muslim in the way that Evelyn Al-Sultani talks about it, where it's always linked together. So the scholarship on Arab American immigration almost uniformly touts one central claim, and that is that prior to 9/11, US citizenship for Arab immigrants pivoted on the question of whether they were white. And so their claims for citizenship depended upon their ability to demonstrate their whiteness. The first waves of Arab immigrants came to the US between 1880 and World War II, and this early group, which was from Greater Syria, here, and largely Christian, entered a US context defined by the Naturalization Act of 1790, which decreed that only, in quotes, free white persons, unquote, could become citizens. This definition of US citizenship was forged in a black-white racial binary in which slaves and free blacks were ineligible for citizenship, and that remained true until just 10 years before Arab immigration began in 1870, when the act was amended to include African-descended peoples. For immigrants who define themselves by family, village, region, and religious affiliations, the term white and the black-white binary on which it was based meant little. Truthfully, whiteness was ill-defined by the 1790 Act itself, which seemed to operate by the "we'll know it when we see it" rule of thumb. Or more precisely, the Act only defined whiteness in contrast to the black Americans it sought to keep out, leaving lots of room for gray. It was that gray area that was to be contested ground in the decades to follow. In 1882, Congress, responding to rampant racism and xenophobia, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring all immigration from China, the first in a series of federal statutes excluding Asians from immigrating to the US and limiting their citizenship and property rights. That same year, US immigration and census officials tried to define the Arab immigrants in their midst as, in quotes, Turks. 7 years later, however, they changed their mind and they decided that they would use the term Syrians, which they defined as an allegedly distinct racial and ethnic group. Truthfully, however, until World War I, immigration officials described immigrants from various regions, so whether they were Assyrians, Arabians, Armenians, and Turks, just all of those were called Syrians. And to confuse things even further, the US Census in 1910 classified Syrians under the larger grouping of, in quotes, Turkey in Asia. So that designation mattered because it helped draw a genealogical line between Arabs and Asians, the latter of which was distinctly not white. Beginning in 1913, in a series of cases now known as the Arab racialization prerequisite cases, federal courts responded to Arab immigrants' naturalization petitions by adjudicating the question of whether they were white or not. That year, Faraz Shahid, an immigrant who'd resided in the US for 11 years, sought naturalization and was denied by South Carolina Judge Smith, who ruled that Shahid was not, quote, that particular free white person to whom the 1790 Act of Congress had denoted the privilege of citizenship. Free white persons, the judge continued, means persons as then understood to be of European habitancy and descent. The next year, Judge Smith, in a ruling against another Syrian immigrant, George Dow, reiterated this position, concluding that Dow was, quote, excluded because he was an Asiatic and not a European. To be sure, the judiciary did not uniformly agree with Judge Smith. In 1909 and 1910, federal courts recognized Syrians as whites and granted them US citizenship. One Georgia District Court judge wrote, I consider the Syrians as belonging to what we recognize and what the world recognizes as the white race. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court overturned that decision on appeal, and during this period, judges were sort of deciding Arab naturalization petitions in sort of inconsistent and contradictory calibrations that were always shifting, fueled by pseudoscience, nativist political pressures, and personal bias, sometimes deciding Arabs were whites and other times deciding they were not. One factor that appears to be decisive in these early cases was the petitioner's avowed religion. Simply put, Christianity was a distinct legal advantage. In a case, Halagian, a district court judge reversed a lower court's rejection of Halagian's petition, granting him citizenship after writing a lengthy historical explanation of how Armenians came to be Christian. He concluded, these facts are stated without reproach to the followers of Muhammad or Zoroaster, because history has shown Christianity in the Near East has generally manifested a sympathy with Europe rather than with Asia as a whole. The gray area in which Arab plaintiffs often found themselves is even more evident when considering the different outcomes in naturalization cases brought by Muslims just 17 months apart. In 1942, Ahmed Hassan, a Muslim from Yemen, asked the US District Court to grant his petition for naturalization. despite the fact that he was armed with affidavits explaining that his dark coloring was, quote, typical of Arabs from the region due to the, in quotes, intense heat and the blazing sun of that area, and that Arabs were, quote, remote descendants of and therefore members of the Caucasian or white race, Hassan's petition was denied. In his opinion, Judge Arthur Tuttle proclaimed, Arabs are not white persons, both because of their dark skin and the fact that they are Muslims. A wide gulf, he wrote, separates their culture from that of the predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. It cannot be expected that as a class they would readily intermarry with our population and be assimilated into our civilization. So intermarriage, as it has been in terms of anti-black racism, was kind of a central category. If judicial bias against Islam seemed to render Arabs non-white, such bias was soon to become susceptible to geopolitical concerns. Less than 2 years later, in April 1944, petitioner Mohammed Moriz won naturalization when another district court decided that, quote, the Arab passes muster as a white person, unquote. An opinion he came to after considering the U.S.'s geopolitical interest in developing friendly relations with other nations. This judicial decision was once again supported by the U.S. Census Bureau and the Immigration and Naturalization Service, both of which defined Arabs as white by the end of World War II. At the dawn of what Henry Luce called the American century, economic and political self-interest began to trump religion in determining the whiteness of Arabs. As Bayoumi puts it, if in Hassan religion produces race, then in Moriez, politics directly sways legal racial discrimination. While these cracks in the facade of whiteness were indeed important, they took place against a backdrop of more and more restrictive immigration policy. The 1924 National Origin Act slowed down the flow of Arab immigration to a trickle, reducing to 100 per year the number of immigrants from the Middle East. This quota system, one that privileged, no, I just lost my place. Privileged European ancestry and sought to firmly control the race and ethnicity of immigrants, held sway for decades until it was finally overturned with the Immigration Act of 1965. Reflecting new Cold War realities, that act equalized per-country quotas, established a first-come, first-served priority system, and gave preference to immigrants with special skills and training. As a result, Arab immigration expanded from its earlier base in Syria and Lebanon to include 15,000 immigrants annually from Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Iraq. No other immigration reform has done so much to diversify the Arab population in the US. On the contrary, as we will see, subsequent immigration acts have laid the foundation for the post-9/11 targeting of Arab and Muslim immigrants and citizens. While thus far I've described the halting process by which Arab immigrants have slowly attained inclusion in the US civic body, it's important to note the strong political and legal undertow threatening their claims to US citizenship. The depths of that undertow only became visible after 9/11, but I think the signs were there at least as early as the 1970s. Nabil Abraham, an analyst of Arab and Muslim racialization, persuasively argues that the positioning of this population as racially indeterminate and politically suspicious, a population filled with religious zealots, in quotes, and terrorists has occurred in three ways. One, political violence by extremist groups based on the Arab-Israeli conflict, though it's worth noting that the JDL and other extremist organizations were responsible for 20 terrorist incidents against Arab foreign offices or Arab American organizations in the 1980s alone. But all of that kind of violence gets pushed out onto Arab immigrants. Susan Akram adds a fourth factor to this list, and that, xenophobic violence targeting Arabs and Muslims at the local level, so that's the second factor. And third, hostility arising from international crises affecting the US. For example, the 1980 Iranian hostage crisis of the first Gulf War. So first you have violence, then you have xenophobic violence by white Americans perpetrated against Arab immigrants or people they assume to be Arab. And then thirdly, you have hostility that comes with political crises on the international level. Susan Akram adds a fourth factor to this list, and that is the, quote, deliberate misinformation, distortion, and institutionalized racism existing in government, law enforcement, and influential institutions that target Arabs and Muslims both within the US and abroad. So each of these factors, I think, has left Arab and Muslim immigrants vulnerable. A few examples make the point. In 1972, the Nixon administration launched what they called Operation Boulder in response to the kidnapping and murder of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. Working with Israeli intelligence and pro-Israel organizations in the US, the government spied on the Arab and Muslim community and then shared that intelligence with the Israeli government. Defining, quote, Arabs as terrorists, unquote, the FBI began compiling dossiers on Arab and Muslim organizations and individuals using wiretaps and other means to gather information about political memberships, personal connections, and even magazine and journal subscriptions. Before it officially ended in 1975, Operation Boulder intimidated Arab and Muslim communities, as you would imagine, by restricting their freedom of movement within the US, by deporting hundreds on legal technicalities, and by restricting immigration from the Arab world. In the end, however, as is often true in these cases, the operation never turned up evidence of any terrorist plot. In 1986, against the backdrop of the Iran-Iraq War and a terrorist bombing of a Berlin nightclub, the Reagan-led Immigration and Naturalization Service created a plan that it dubbed Alien Terrorists and Undesirables, a contingency plan, in which it proposed converting 2 southern military compounds into World War II-style internment camps for Iranians and Arabs. After the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the first Bush administration charged the FBI with interrogating Arab and Muslim leaders, activists, and anti-war demonstrators, all kind of lumped together, across the country. And George H.W. Bush's Department of Justice began fingerprinting all residents and immigrants in the U.S. of, in quotes, Arab origin, and the FAA began airline profiling of travelers from the Arab world. In addition to these examples of the federal government's suspicious approach to the Arab and Muslim community, a more wholesale change in U.S. jurisprudence has been underway since the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was then that Congress stripped the power to create immigration law from the federal courts and placed it in its own hands. And that has enormous civil rights consequences because, as critic Fulgana Sheth writes, it means that immigrants, quote, become subject to a body of law and to a mode of treatment that is separate and mostly distinct from the rest of American and constitutional law. So, for example, immigrants are not automatically granted constitutionally mandated protections, such as writ of habeas corpus, the right to due process, routine judicial review, and the right to an attorney, exclusions that have withstood multiple Supreme Court challenges. This legally sanctioned distinction between citizen and immigrant facilitates a more pernicious distinction between those who are entitled to civil rights and those who are not. Alexander Bickel puts it this way: it's always been easier, it will always be easier, to think of someone as a non-citizen than to decide she or he is a non-person. Or in Sheth's formulation, the immigrant is one of us, i.e. human, but she or he is not, or not yet, human like us, which means that she or he can be subject to differentiated or even non-existent rights. One begins to understand how the immigrant can quickly become a rightsless person when considering the phenomenon of secret evidence cases. In these cases, and there were 25 in the decade of the 1990s alone, so before the War on Terror officially started, the INS refused to disclose to the immigrant or his or her legal counsel the basis for detention or deportation. And the government claims it doesn't just use these, in quote, secret evidence cases solely against Arabs and Muslims, but there's no independent research that can actually prove that that's the case. So we just don't know. That's part of the whole secret thing. At the same time, the Congress allocated to itself the power to make immigration law. It also gave federal authorities the, quote, sole power to enforce immigration policy. As attorneys Susan Akram and Kevin Johnson argue in a recent article, consolidating immigration enforcement at the federal level can, quote, exacerbate the negative civil rights impacts because the federal government can act with greater haste and authority than can individual states. After 9/11, they conclude this haste brought, quote, harsh consequences to the Arab and Muslim community in the United States. Unfortunately, this so-called plenary power doctrine shields both Congress and the congressional and the executive branch from judicial scrutiny of their substantive immigration judgments. So what I'm saying here is that you have Congress allocating this power to itself, but it can't actually be subject to, nor can the executive branch, the president, be subject to any kind of judicial review. So in the last few minutes, I've been trying to complicate the story I told about Arab American racialization by arguing that even if government bureaucracies and legal precedent eventually deem them white and thus eligible for full enfranchisement, Congress and the executive branch acted to position Arab and Muslim communities as suspect and potentially dangerous populations. In other words, 9/11 was not some kind of wholesale shift, but rather exacerbated certain tendencies already afoot with then horrifying intensity. So the second section is called Arab Americans, the New Black, in question mark. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, over 1,000 Muslim and Arab non-citizens were arrested and detained. And this number may be a conservative estimate, according to legal scholar Erwin Chemerinsky, because the Bush Justice Department shrouded the arrests, detentions, and deportations of non-citizens in secrecy, and the Supreme Court said they could do it. An additional 5,000 non-citizen men were subject to, in quotes, voluntary interviews on the suspicion that they may have been harboring terrorists. If they refused, so this is where the voluntary is totally hypothetical, their visas could be revoked and they could be immediately deported. When those interviews yielded nothing useful, then Attorney General John Ashcroft announced his intention to interview an additional 3,000 young Arab, in quotes, men. 2 months later, on December 5th, Ashcroft sent a directive to INS to round up 6,000 young Arab men who had ignored deportation orders. It's worth just saying that that number represents 2% of the individuals who were violating deportation orders. So it was like a tiny fraction of people who actually do this. So it was clearly a very kind of minute, selective targeting. With the passage of the Patriot Act on October 26, 2001, after little public debate and no public hearing, law enforcement found itself authorized to, quote, conduct searches, employ electronic surveillance, and detain suspected terrorists. Broader definitions of terrorist activity and terrorist organizations gave new license to immigration authorities to remove or deny access to individuals and their relatives. Stunningly, these broader definitions are retroactive, so someone could be deported or denied entry to the US for associating with an organization even before the State Department said it was a terrorist organization. So you can sort of look back as far as you want, historically speaking. If definitions of terrorism and terrorists have been newly expanded, so too has the knee-jerk association of Islam with terrorism. Profiling based on religion and country of origin was both commonplace and widely accepted right after 9/11, and only nominally so, less so in the years immediately following 2001. Arguably, 9/11 affected a new form of race and religion where Muslim, terrorist, and non-white are all now associatively linked. The strongest evidence for such a shift is perhaps the National Security Special Registration Entry-Exit System, which is also known as Special Registration, instituted in August 2002. Under this system, non-immigrant and immigrant men from 25 different countries, including Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, were required to register with the Bureau of Homeland Security and submit to questioning. In the accompanying memo, Ashcroft declared, quote, in this new war, our enemy's platoons rely upon avoiding detection at the border, quietly blending in with visiting tourists, students, and workers. They move unnoticed through our cities, neighborhoods, and public spaces. That these countries were majority Muslim seemed to matter more than the fact that the US enjoyed friendly relations with most of them. So whereas before there was a kind of association that was more friendly because there was a kind of geopolitical alliance, after that became irrelevant. Possessing citizenship, country of national origin became a shorthand for religion, which became a shorthand for terrorists, though there's some evidence that Christian Arabs suffered less discrimination than their Muslim counterparts. However, possessing citizenship or permanent residency shielded men from the 25 countries identified, suggesting that those with citizenship or quasi-citizenship escaped bureaucratic suspicion. And this has been a big issue of debate around the Tsarnaevs, because they, one was a citizen. And so then the question is, why wasn't there more scrutiny? And what kinds of powers do we have to scrutinize people once they've become legal citizens? NSEERS undoubtedly had a pernicious impact on immigration and naturalization applications, as evidenced by the fact that when the program concluded in December 2003, over 175,000 men had been registered, in quotes, and almost 14,000 men were in the midst of being deported. And those numbers don't include people who left the country voluntarily as a climate of fear and intimidation took hold. On December 1st, 2003, the Department of Homeland Security suspended the domestic registration requirement, though men coming into the US are still subject to special registration, and the kinder, gentler, we call it Us Visit program, replaced NSEERS altogether in 2004. So a slippage between Muslim and immigrant, both of which are indicators of outsider status, seems to be a particular hallmark of the post-9/11 moment, something Vijay Prashad connects to racism. Muslim has come to stand in for those who look or sound like immigrants. He continues, so if Muslim means immigrant, we should follow Etienne Balibar's insistence that immigration becomes the main name given to race within the crisis-torn nations of the post-colonial era. I would suggest, however, that the racialization of Arabs and Muslims is inflected by, but not reducible to that. While immigrants, be they Arab or Latino, are a familiar and ubiquitous target of conservative lawmakers and fringe groups like the Tea Party, Bush administration rhetoric, policies, and programs, including NSEERS and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, created a strong association between Islam and terrorism that citizenship and country of origin ceased to be the pivot around which Arab racial formation whirled. So the operative dyad here is not Muslim and immigrant, but rather Muslim and terrorist. And that's the slippage that's proven most pernicious and indelible in terms of Arab racialization. So this section, it's the last section, is called The Rise of Jihad Joe, and I'll explain how I got that little moniker. So now I want to try to connect the racial dynamics about which I've been speaking to the changes in the racial representation of African Americans, both in politics and in popular culture. First, I'm going to consider how the Bush administration manipulated black racial symbolism to enlist support for its so-called war on terror, but then I want to conclude by then turning to sleeper cell and traitor. In August 2003, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice spoke in front of a National Association of Black Journalists in what was described as a, quote, conversation with her about the war in Iraq and its aftermath. 3 months earlier, President George W. Bush had declared mission accomplished, and he was basking in approval ratings much higher than the 22% to which they would eventually sink. Speaking in front of what might be termed the hometown crowd, the first black and female national security advisor confidently worked the crowd. So, yeah. Like many of you, she said at one point, I grew up around the homegrown terrorism of the 1960s. The bombing of the church in Birmingham in 1963 is one that will forever be in my memory, because one of the little girls that died was a friend of mine, she went on. 40 years removed from the tragedy, I can honestly say that Denise McNair and the others did not die in vain. Because of their sacrifice, America's a better nation and a better example to a world where difference is still often taken as a license to kill. Then, Rice veered into what can only be described as truly bizarre territory. So here she says, knowing what we know about the civil rights struggle, we should never, ever indulge in the condescending voices who allege that some people in Africa or in the Middle East are just not interested in freedom, they're culturally just not ready for freedom, or they just aren't ready for freedom's responsibilities. Now here she's talking about anti-war protesters. We've heard that argument before, and we more than any as a people should be ready to reject it. It was wrong in 1960s Birmingham, and it's wrong in Baghdad in 2003. Needless to say, the comparison between Birmingham and Baghdad, to quote one eyewitness, quote, fell flat. Although odd, the comparison is instructive in a number of ways because it tells us something about Bush-era attempts to align our historical memory of the civil rights movement with the so-called war on terror. It also reveals state efforts to interpolate black Americans into US empire-building projects, efforts that borrow the language and idealism of 60s-era activism in the name of US imperialism. Rice's remarks were meant to connect black freedom struggles and the US occupation of Iraq, white-robed Klansmen, and Iraqi armed resistors. Rice tried to reframe the civil rights movement by eliding the fact that it was as much about overturning US racial and imperial logics as it was about gaining equal rights for black Americans. Instead, in Rice's reframing, the civil rights movement became about recognizing already imminent democratic ideals rather than realizing a new global vision of racial equity and national autonomy. In her retelling, Iraq in 2003 was Jim Crow America circa 1963. Black nonviolence then was US military violence now. And perhaps most offensive of all, protesters against the war on terror were positioned as Southern segregationists who do not think Iraqis are, quote, ready for freedom's responsibilities. So here, Rice, I think, perverted a central logic of the civil rights movement, framing imperialism as an expansion of anti-racism rather than its opposite. Internationalization of the civil rights movement in Rice's hands meant occupation and Western domination rather than racial equality and national autonomy. Rice's suturing of such contradictory elements, her cynical appropriation of the civil rights movement, was made possible within a Bush-era context in which Black Americans themselves were positioned as ideal patriots. Recall Secretary of State Colin Powell's testimony at the UN Security Council, which helped secure international sanction for the Iraq invasion, even as it hastened his resignation in 2005 and paved the way for Rice to succeed him. From the onset of the War on Terror, Black Americans have been front and center in foreign policy debates, in televisual representations, and in military troop depictions, positioned as ideal US ambassadors. So for example, the main spokesperson during the height of the Iraq War was a Black American who every day his job was to go out and report what had happened that day in the war. Articulating the US civil rights movement to the global war on terror, Black bodies have helped solidify what Chris Newfield has recently called a war democracy that blurs the line between non-citizen and suspect, the domestic and the international. Collapsing distinctions between civilians and combatants, disenfranchised minorities and white elites, between US state power and US Black power, helps to accomplish what David Harvey describes as the passage from neoliberal to neoconservative imperialism. Nowhere is this vexed formula more in evidence than in the recent TV show Sleeper Cell. So I want to talk a little bit about Sleeper Cell to give you a sense of like what the kind of narrative structure is, and then I'll just say a little bit about Traitor. So the show Sleeper Cell, which aired on Showtime in both 2005 and 2006, was both critically acclaimed and actually, shockingly, considering how bad the acting is, it was Emmy nominated. The show updates the undercover cop plot for the age of global terror. So the show begins as Darwin El-Said, an African-American Sunni Muslim who's also an FBI agent, infiltrates a terrorist cell that's preparing to carry out a chemical attack on LA. Comprised of an international cast of characters, the cell includes Tommy, who's a blonde, blue-eyed, all-American type who's rebelling against his domineering professor mother, Bobby, a mild-mannered family man, Christian, a former French skinhead who converted to Islam, and Ilya, a Bosnian survivor of the Serbian War who blames the US for the genocide of the Bosnians. Farak, a Saudi national and veteran of several holy wars, they just kind of lump them all together, is their ruthless, charismatic leader. The second season employs the exact same formula, grouping together a different, similarly motley crew of would-be terrorists, with Darwin himself as the cell's leader. The new characters include Benny, a Latino ex-gang member who converts to Islam in prison, Mina, a Dutch former prostitute who seeks revenge for her husband's death in Iraq, and Salim, a gay British-Iraqi exile whose faith conflicts with his sexual desires. The substitutability inherent in Sleeper Cell's premise, I think, enables it to have a kind of serial-like quality that can be adapted. And in fact, the Showtime's Robert Greenblatt once said that they were thinking that they would just kind of resurrect Sleeper Cell every few years so that they could use it as a way of, and this is the part I love, revisiting or assessing the progress in the war on terror. So they're going to write a TV show to assess the progress in the war on terror. Sleeper Cell and other war on terror dramas use many of the strategies that critic Evelyn Al-Sitani has identified as central to a post-9/11 visual representation strategy. And I don't want to spend too much time on them, but I do want to mention them because I think they're strategies that are employed in Sleeper Cell and Traitor, but they also happen, a lot of these strategies, through the presence of Black men. So these are just the things that she talks about as strategies that TV shows and popular culture more generally use. So one of them is you have a patriotic Arab and Muslim American who's the counterpart to the bad ones. Oh, can't do it that way. You have a sort of moment where there's sympathy for the plight of Arab and Muslim Americans after 9/11. So there'll be some mention of discrimination and how bad that is. You get a challenging of this idea that Arabs and Muslims are the same thing because you'll have this kind of motley crew of Muslims who kind of come together in the Sleeper Cell. Flipping the enemy, so this was the kind of thing that 24 did where you thought it was one person who was the villain and then it turned out to be like once it was the president of the US who was like working against the US, like, you know, it's just kind of any sort of improbable person you wouldn't suspect. Humanizing the terrorists, so, you know, as I was saying, Ilya is the survivor of the Bosnian genocide, so you feel bad that his entire family has been killed. It's a small world after all, so, you know, multicultural U.S. society. We're a society in the U.S. of freedom, etc. Why is the lamp dimming? Creating a fictional Middle Eastern or Muslim country. So like Kamistan, or just different places that, Agraba, like all sorts of just different silly things. Okay. So what I want to sort of do now is to think about how all of those strategies cohere around the figure of the Black American, and especially the Black male American. All right, so Darwin, oh, actually, let me do this first. So Trader has exactly the same premise in the sense that he's a Black American. Actually, he's an African from the Sudan, American, who is part of infiltrates a sleeper cell. He's a Black Muslim, very devout, and the whole movie is just about him trying to bring down the cell. Like this, and I'll show you a little bit of it, there's a large section of the film. So in Trader, it's an hour of the 2-hour film during which you actually don't know whether or not he is a terrorist or not. And the same thing happens with Sleeper Cell, where for the first 20 minutes of the first episode, you don't know, is he a terrorist or is he not? And that's, I'll explain more about why I think that happens. So Darwin, played by Michael Ealy, is a soft-spoken, contemplative man who seems very kind of world-weary. His very identities are depicted as being at war with one another. The FBI and the US more broadly cannot understand nor really sympathize with Muslims, even as they need their help to foil domestic terrorism. And on the other hand, the terrorists want to destroy the America that Darwin calls home. A patriotic, devout Muslim is incomprehensible to both sides, making Darwin the perfect spy shuttling between these two worlds. The show tries to dispel the idea that Islam and the US are in conflict, but at the same time, it constantly sort of returns back to the fact that the US and Islam are in conflict, according to this. So there's a lot of focus on the piety of Darwin, and same thing in Trader, rather than his patriotism. So what he's doing is always about fighting for the good Islam. It's not about fighting against Islam, and it's not about fighting for the US. Those are never the terms that are used. And in fact, he's kind of disaffected. All right, so if there's a kind of religious struggle that's taking place on the show, there's little overt attention to the fact that Darwin is Black, even though the show depends upon it in terms of how Black male bodies signify. So Sleeper Cell would have you believe that Darwin's Blackness is kind of incidental. It's actually central, however, to the war on terror dramas in both implicit and explicit ways. For one, Darwin's Blackness provides an unspecified motivation for his involvement in terrorism that's made explicit for other characters. So while each of the Sleeper Cell members has a backstory explaining why they turned to terrorism, Darwin's cover story is simply that he's a Black ex-con, a status that sufficiently explains his disaffection to his Sleeper cellmates. While plot time is devoted to teasing out each character's kind of psychological motivations, Darwin's cover story is simply that his skin color. In fact, the narrative turns on the presumption that Darwin's Black skin is a metonym for civic alienation, a view that's reinforced from our first glimpse of Darwin through the bars of his prison cell. And incidentally, I would just say that this is also true for Benny, the Latino gang member, so they never talk about why he also would be involved in this. We're just supposed to know that if you're Latino and a gang member and went to jail, you would, of course, be involved in terrorism. And I think the reason that this is important and the reason it's happening is because it allows these shows, which up until 9/11, sort of the central thing that many of these shows talked about was the war on drugs, right? And so the central people who were targeted during the war on drugs were African American and Latino. And so you can kind of merge those two kinds of concerns without having to say that that's what you're doing. Say more, but I actually want to show some clips. So I'm sure you've been looking at these while I've been chattering on. These just give you an idea of sort of the main profile. So, he's very devout, he speaks Arabic, he knows the Quran better than the other Muslims he meets. I think the big important point here is that here African Americans are mediators between the two sort of allegedly opposed communities. So they're against fundamentalists and terrorists, but they're also not really part of the FBI. They're part, but they're not part. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that either, but okay. So I want to just talk about a few characteristics of this and how it gets displayed in the actual shows. So, so this is the very beginning of the first episode.
I just want to say goodbye. Remember this day. Remember what it feels like to leave this place and don't come back, no matter what. If it comes down to it, let the devil shoot you in your motherfucking head before you let him stick you back into one of their prisons. Remember? All the laws of man are evil. Only the laws of God are just. The key to your higher purpose.
A little bit longer sequence from Trader, which plays on some of the same, as I said, for the first hour you don't know whether or not he actually is a terrorist. So the clip I was going to show that I can't show you is, that is illegal to show you, is so Samir Horn, who's the protagonist of Sleeper Cell, goes to see his girlfriend in a public park. He knows he's being followed, and so he drives his car while he's being followed to a Chicago housing project. And so there's this moment where he gets to the housing project, he goes in, he like puts his little hoodie up and he goes inside, and the cops who are following him are afraid to go inside. So it's literally treated as like this is another country that's foreign and also like hostile. So they won't go inside. They're like, we're waiting for backup, even though he's this, terrorist. It's urgent they get him. So he goes in, and so there's this whole scene of the two FBI agents who've been following him the whole time coming. And they go up the stairs, and there's all these black men. It's all just black men. And they go up these stairs, and there are black men surrounding them. And the bad cop, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, says, don't worry, fellas, we're not here for you. And it's like, oh. And then they like go off and look for him. So there's this way in which the way it's shot, the way it's populated, like all these black actors who probably, this is all the work they do is like populating ghettos. All of that is sort of encoded in this moment where they're chasing him. Is the conflation of civil rights and the war on terror. So this happens in both films, again, and it's it was subtly actually apparent in the first clip that I showed, because we're supposed to sort of know that the librarian is a black Muslim in the sort of, stripe of the 1960s era, which is why he has to, have that little speech at that point. But anyway, this is something that you see a lot of. And I think the reason for it, very simply put, is to sort of demonstrate the fact that we're past a certain kind of anti-black racism. And the civil rights movement is sort of, clues to that. So I will show you the clip I am able to show you. So this is Darwin going to see his father, who he's estranged from.
That's good. Good
good job keeping it up. You had some good times in this house.
What are those?
Yeah. I spoke to your doctor about your diet. This is stuff you should be eating.
How much do I owe you?
Quit, please. I'm just trying.
I said, how much do I owe you?
My father and I'm trying to help. Why do you have to be like that?
Because you betrayed me, Darwin. Everything I believe, everything I'm about. And I'm not going to forgive you for it just because you buy me some sugar-free groceries.
Okay, so you make all these grand speeches about the black man being victimized, and you've wasted the last 20 years playing the victim. I'm sorry, Pop. I'm sorry if I chose Mom when you two got divorced, but my whole life cannot be about that moment. I was 10 fucking years old. I was a goddamn kid.
Don't you dare curse in my house. It wasn't about that moment. It's about everything since the Army, the FBI.
The Army because of you.
I didn't have a choice. You got a boss, Darwin, a supervisor. What color is he, huh? Pretty pale, I bet. How many black agents they even got in the FBI? Come on, be honest. Your government's war on terror strategy is a joke anyway.
It's not my strategy, but it is my war. And I'm not just going to avoid it. If I did, I wouldn't be your son. Look at me. Look at me. My posture when I walk into a room. Head up, shoulders back, that's from watching you. My love of history and reading came from sitting in that living room right over there. You reading to me until I could read to myself. We lost 20 years. How many more we got left?
Demonstrates the last kind of facet that I want to talk about, which is the good cop, bad cop. So in all of these shows, there is a good white cop and a bad white cop. In Traitor, we find out that the good cop, his dad, was a preacher in the South during the 1960s who would go to houses where crosses had been burned and you know, put them out and do various things to kind of protect black people. And this is why his son is now involved in the war on terror. We also learned that the good cop has a PhD in Arabic studies, and he has all of these ways in which he understands and knows the sort of, you know, struggle. And then the bad cop is usually just kind of crudely racist and violent. And I think part of the reason that they need this dynamic is that they want to sort of, while they've said like anti-black racism is over, they want to acknowledge anti-Muslim racism. And so the way in which they sort of do that is to have one cop who, you know, presents that sort of side, and then the other constantly reminding the bad cop that he's a bad cop. In Sleeper Cell, we find out that the good cop was involved in the war in Afghanistan. So that's his entry.
Who is the African-American member of your cell?
This is the main evil guy who's being tortured.
That was Martin.
for the king.
Oh, wait, excuse me? Fairness, how far, huh? Act like a fucking jihadi for God's sakes. Now, do me a favor, Bob. Babysit this raghead for me while I go to the bathroom. I gotta take a shit out. Or is it a Sunni?
What?
We sit there with pen and paper day after day. I know this is being recorded. Audio, video. So what's the point?
It's my process. Sure you had a process? Maybe you still do, even now. No, I would.
So, no bites for Velasquez.
No, I think he's clean. Let's leave him in peace.
Later, the good cop and Farag will have this debate about how fundamentalist Christianity is the same thing as fundamentalist Islam, etc. Okay, so I just want to say, in just closing, positioning Black Americans and Islamic terrorists as mirror images of one another, one the doppelganger of the other, enables Sleeper Cell to immunize its depictions of Muslims against charges of anti-Arab racism. It calls up the implied history of the modern civil rights movement as an alibi against charges that the current war on terror might be violating civil rights instead of protecting them. More importantly, it takes advantage of a newly visible kind of blackness, the black man as the stealth terror warrior, the ideal patriot and a unique ambassador for the 21st century. Put another way, Black Americans in the rhetorical landscape of the war on terror serve, to borrow Chef's words, as the, quote, historical memory and the institutional moral conscience. There's a kind of symbolic structure represented by the black male body in Sleeper Cell and Traitor. There, we as both viewer and embodiment of the nation, and I'm talking about American audiences, are reminded that Black Americans were once wrongly outcast, but through a process of expiation, otherwise known as the Civil Rights Movement, the nation has earned the wisdom necessary to outcast another group, but this time for the, in quotes, right reasons. Thank you.